On certain nights, the past doesn't sleep. It glows quietly beneath the surface of sidewalks and shadows, like a page of parchment that never fully fades. Paris, city of light, love, and revolution, has known every version of silence. But on one particular night in 1940, as candles flickered, boots marched, and window panes trembled, the Eiffel Tower went dark. Not because someone forgot, but because no one was allowed to remember. Before the darkness came, Paris flickered like a living poem, held together by rhythm and light. In the evenings, especially just after dinner, the city did not sleep. It breathed, from balconies cloaked in laundry, from windows lined with potted geraniums, from bakeries restocking tonight's bread for tomorrow's sunrise. All day, the streets danced with clangs and clatters. Bells tanned in lace gloves, children chased wheels. Cobblers hummed old chansons while tapping heels into hand-sewn shoes. And then came the privacy of evening. Precious, quiet hours when everyone slowed. The shutters were cracked, but not closed. Lights inside grew golden. And soon, one by one, the beams of the Eiffel Tower kissed the sky again. Her glow wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself with fireworks or display. It was steady, as if reaching into alleys and boulevards and boudoirs, whispering, "This is Paris. You are home. You are safe." She had not always been beloved. People once called her an iron skeleton. Some artists hated her metal mess so much they dined inside her just to avoid seeing her outside. But over time, she became a heartbeat, visible from almost anywhere, especially at night, especially on clear evenings. Even the pigeons took their cues from her pulse, circling the top before roosting, as if bowing slightly before disappearing into the dark. And so, in that warm hour, after supper, before sleep, people gathered quietly under her shadow. Lovers leaned mid-kiss under her arches. Photographers traced her silhouette with trembling lens. Street musicians tuned old violins facing her silhouette. And Parisians simply looked up. They didn't speak. They didn't need to, because when people saw the Eiffel Tower glow, they didn't just see architecture. They saw permanence. It is no small thing to believe that the world will continue tomorrow. But that's exactly what the Eiffel Tower meant. When her lights turned on every night, rain or shine, cold or warm, joy or grief, she said, "You will wake up tomorrow. Paris will still stand. You are in a land of poets and painters, not tanks and warnings." She said all this softly every night, with nothing more than 10,000 lights and a little persistence. And so, that night, the one history rarely names, the one tucked quietly beneath headlines and front pages, people began to hear something. Not music, not sirens, but something missing, something at the edge of sound, an absence. The lights of the Eiffel Tower flickered once, then again, and then they stopped. Parisians paused. No announcement, no burst of flame, just darkness. Those who had grown used to her rhythm felt it immediately, like a clock whose tick goes missing or a radio cut mid-note. And they waited. Some held their breath. Others mouthed what happened, but could not say it aloud. A man still rinsing espresso cups in a back room glanced out his kitchen window. He had never noticed how black the sky could be without her, how alone the rooftops looked now, that their favorite neighbor had turned her face away. Even the pigeons quieted. Their usual flutter above her peak vanished. They, too, knew something had changed. And deep inside her beams, where wind and steel usually hummed with memory, there lingered only a silence. That belonged to another country, another language. It was not the silence of night. It was a silence of fear, soft at first, but blooming. When invaders march into a city, it does not always begin with shouting. Sometimes it starts with stillness. The morning was pale, as if even the sun was cautious that day. Birdsong paused. Curtains swayed not from breeze, but from the quiet hands quickly pulling them back inside. In the distance they came, long columns of foreign vehicles, helmets glinting, boots in rhythm, faces unreadable. They entered Paris not with chaos, but with order. Grim, slow-moving mechanical order. Their tanks rolled down the Champs-Élysées, not crushing rubble or resistance, but rolling through silence, a silence held by millions of lips and held in millions of lungs. Shopkeepers closed their shutters as if to say, "We are closed now, not just for business, but for dreaming." Children were ushered indoors, chairs abandoned, radios turned down. By nightfall, the city wore a new uniform, black cloth-covered statues and signs. Red flags with twisted iron symbols hung from ancient French balconies. Like unwanted guests refusing to leave, the cafes still stood. The boulangeries still smelled of dough. But now, they seemed to shrink into themselves, as if ashamed to be alive when freedom had died in the hallway. In Montparnasse, a woman dropped a glass bottle in the street, and the shattering sound echoed far too loudly. No one moved. No one helped her pick it up. Everyone looked only forward, not at each other, not at the uniforms. Forward. Some Parisians clapped, believing submission meant survival. Others wept quietly, behind curtains stitched with family names. Now too dangerous to speak aloud. Phones no longer rang. Letters arrived opened. The Eiffel Tower stood in silhouette, its soul dim like an eye forced to remain open through sorrow. They say the Eiffel Tower went dark to prevent Allied bombers from navigating by it. But here is a thought. Perhaps she dimmed herself, not out of tactic, but out of protest. A quiet refusal to shine for the men who had stolen her city. For decades she had glowed proudly. Her shimmer signaled to lovers and revolutionaries, to artists and philosophers. Now, she merely stood, dark and watching, like a candle beside a corpse. People spoke less. Church bells were silenced. Even the pigeons seemed to fly lower, as if weighted by the history hanging in the smoky air. But even in fear, Paris remained listening. She listened to every heavy boot that cracked her cobblestones. She counted every knocked door. She remembered every curfew bell. The world watched from afar, seeing only a city handed over, with no battle, no flames. But inside her bones, Paris was at war, not with bullets, but with despair. Soon, it would become illegal to say certain words, to gather at the wrong cafe, to play certain songs, to name certain names. And yet, people remembered everything. The invasion didn't erase identity. It only pushed it beneath the floorboards. The soul of Paris slipped underground, and the light over her roofline vanished. But she endured. Resistance. It wasn't always loud. It wasn't always fiery. In fact, in the beginning, it was mostly done in whispers. When Paris fell under occupation, freedom didn't vanish. It simply went underground, beneath the shops and stones. Inside, quiet attics filled with dust and old photographs. Behind stacks of wine bottles in ancient cellars, the city hid its heartbeat. And in that heartbeat grew a new kind of courage, one that moved with silence instead of speeches, with fabric instead of flags, with ink instead of weapons. A tailor in the 7th arrondissement began sewing small codes into the linings of jackets. Each stitch a number, a place, a promise. The thread was red, always red, like the reminder of something spilled or something worth risking. A schoolteacher continued marking student papers by day, but at night she marked maps, routes in and out of train yards, delivery schedules, weak points in the armored rail fleet. She made sure to keep her best notes in faded French literature books, because no soldier ever bothered to open a volume of Molière. There was no uniform for the resistance, no medals, no pay, just quiet eyes and carefully folded secrets carried in hollow shoe soles or hidden in baguettes beneath wax paper. You will meet him at the fountain. Don't speak unless he says a passphrase. The ink will disappear with heat. Burn it if you're caught. And if you were caught, there would be no trial, only silence, and possibly a knock at your family's door that would never be answered again. In certain quartiers, Parisians kept watch from behind shuttered apartments, tracking movement of German soldiers with the rhythm of footsteps and the rattle of armored boot heels. Those lucky enough to own a shortwave radio became listeners. Decoders of hope beamed from London. Sometimes they heard poems, sometimes songs, and sometimes just a phrase like, "The blackbird sings at moonrise." They didn't know what it meant. They didn't need to. All that mattered was that someone out there remembered them. Power came in unexpected forms. A nun who refused to cover the church bell with cloth. A grocer who delivered more than groceries. Hidden beneath canned peaches came contraband paper, film rolls, forged IDs. A child who clipped news articles and slipped them under doors. They weren't waiting for an army. They were the army. Quiet, steady, disguised as everyday life. Sometimes resistance took no form at all, just a decision to smile, or to walk openly, chin high. In a world that wanted your head low, Paris walked on, not proud, not naive, but hopeful, hope in that forgotten way. Like gardeners planting seeds they may never see bloom, like mothers writing full names on the backs of photos, just in case they couldn't say them aloud again. By 1942, more than 100 resistance cells were active in Paris alone. Some were intellectuals, some were carpenters. Many lived double lives, dining with collaborators by day, and sabotaging shipments or forging documents by candlelight. Still, they never called themselves heroes. They called themselves survivors, witnesses, memory keepers. And through it all, the Eiffel Tower still stood quiet. She had not been taken down, not bombed, not chained, but her silence was glaring. A lighthouse with no beam, a drum with no rhythm, as if she too was waiting for the signal, for the spark, for the right kind of light, not from herself, but from them, from the seamstress, from the mapmaker, from the hidden signal in the cold wind over the Seine. When a city loses freedom, it doesn't always crumble in flames. Sometimes it fades, not all at once, but piece by piece, soften, like color washed from a photograph, or warmth leaving a coat left too long in attic air. Food was the first to go. The boulangeries used to smell like home. Sweet air, a promise of morning, the scratch of paper bags. Now they smelled like chalk, empty flour sacks. Waiting. People queued not with shopping baskets, but with little books. Ration cards, folded and creased, were clutched closer than wallets. Because in Paris, during war, a stamp could mean dinner. Children waited in lines before dawn, feet cold in thin socks, cheeks hollow with silence. The bread they clutched when it came was narrow, coarse, often already stale, but they clutched it tightly, like gold, like something they knew not to complain about. Some shops simply closed. Others stayed open but offered very little. Bean tins, coarse soap bricks, salt packets like powdered treasure. A cobbler displayed only 2 shoes in his window because he couldn't afford to show the third. It might be stolen. A bookstore sealed its doors behind thick paper, not because it had nothing left to sell, but because the owner couldn't bear to watch. A great room filled with silence. Even clothing grew tired. Dresses were stitched and restitched. Men wore their father's coats, now patched and too large. One sleeve gone gray with soot. Buttons changed so often. No 2 sets matched. But Parisians adapted. A woman made a hat out of newspaper folded just right. It looked elegant, even from the view of a passing soldier, who might never realize that the headline on her brim once declared Independence Day. Even dignity had to be rationed. And yet, people lined up straight, always straight, standing longer than their legs should allow. Back stiff, expression still. They were not begging. They were enduring. At mealtime, families shared what there was. Half an onion became soup. An egg was divided 6 ways. Bread crust dipped carefully, as if sacred. Real butter became a memory. Meat became myth. Coffee? A perfume, not a drink. But still the table was set. Candles lit. Knives straightened. Names said aloud, even if the chair beside them stayed empty. It wasn't stubbornness. It was love. And love was the one thing the war could not ration. Author Antoine de Saint-Exupéry once wrote, "What is essential is invisible to the eye." And in Paris, 1941, the essential lived in every moment that went unnoticed. A pot of water boiled, not by gas, but by the heat of patience. A letter hand carried across 3 neighborhoods, just to tell a sister, "We are still here." Faces grew thinner, eyes more tired, but in the cracks of slow days, kindness still bloomed. Someone always shared a bit of flour. Someone always left an extra apple on a doorstep, a note under a neighbor's door. Don't forget the market closes early. It's not safe after dark. Even within scarcity, Paris still felt like Paris. The laughter just lived deeper in the lungs. The music, quieter. The dreams, folded small in coat pockets, next to the last sugar cube. And above it all, invisible most days behind soot and gray skies, the Eiffel Tower still waited. There were no picnics beneath her feet, no proposals, no artist sketching her bones. But those who passed her in alleys and trams still glanced upward with something very close to reverence. She wasn't glowing, but then neither were the people. Still they shone what Paris lacked in light. She made up for in courage. And courage, like tea leaves and hope, stretches further than you think. When speaking is forbidden, the body becomes language. The routine becomes protest. And silence speaks. Paris, once loud, lyrical, and lush, was now muted. But even in quiet, there were whispers, not from mouths, but from objects, from light, from color, from symbols. Sometimes a candle meant more than a flame. A tiny puddle of wax left by a windowsill said, "He was here. She keeps watch. We survive." A lamp lit at just the right time, in just the right house, told someone 2 streets over. They weren't alone anymore. A baker's sign, always hung vertical, now tilted 20 degrees to the left. Harmless enough to those not in the know, but to them, it meant a drop point was active, under the park bench near the fountain. Right pocket, not left, newspaper folded twice. These messengers shared only one trait, observers' eyes. They watched everything, and they let their symbols do the talking. And still, the Eiffel Tower watched. Though dark, she had not turned her back. She had simply changed form. What was once steel and light was now myth and motion, resistance without explanation. They say a woman drew a chalk circle at her base every single night before curfew. Never caught, but the circles kept appearing, and soldiers began to notice them. They washed the pavement. The next day, another circle. A boy carved a star into an alley wall, then another nearby, and another. He was never seen again. But years later, someone counted all the stars and found they spelled a phrase. Only one person could have known. La lumière tend. The light waits. Another woman lit a candle near the canal. Every Wednesday, whether the sun had set or not, she didn't speak, didn't look over her shoulder. She just waited 10 minutes, then left. The locals began calling her the lighthouse. Symbols kept growing. A child's red ribbon tied on a gate at the old church, unsafe route. An overturned bicycle on an empty street, officers nearby. Shoelaces double knotted, arrest last night. Be careful. Each life reduced to a code, and yet never more alive. They built a world inside the world. Paper inside paper. Steps inside silence. A grandmother kept a stack of spoons in her window. Always 6. One day, only 5. That was the message. And someone understood. In absence, we create meaning. In stillness, we craft rhythm. And in darkness, we look for light. There was, some say, a man who went each morning to the same bench in Rue St. Paul. Never spoke. Carried only a notebook. Sat there for exactly 14 minutes. One day he didn't come, and in his place there was no man, no book, just a single unopened envelope. Inside, a coded map of German rail movements. No name attached, no reward claimed, just a symbol, and a city that kept moving. They painted stars in closets and scratched arrows beneath stairwells. They folded poems into lampshades, knowing that someday someone would unfold them again. And remember, the Eiffel Tower did not sparkle. She did not shimmer. She did not dance across the skyline. But she watched, and she remembered every signal, left in windows, scratched on stairs, lit for 10 minutes, then blown away, like breath on glass, symbols made of smoke, of chalk, of buttons sewn the other way, of music hummed 3 notes high, then paused. They were the heartbeat, when the body could no longer speak, the Morse code of the soul, speaking softly, so that freedom would echo loudly. In Paris, silence was the loudest kind of resistance. There are certain sounds you never forget, not because they were loud, but because they arrived at exactly the right time. First, it was a faint vibration in the glass, a shimmer on the edge of a teacup, not thunder, not footsteps, but something different from every windowsill. Old ears cocked, young eyes squinted. Then came the long, low hum. Not sirens, not dive bombers. Wings, the people of Paris, so long used to looking downward, now tilted their heads and saw something they hadn't dared to imagine in months. Allied planes, not enemy pilots in gray, but strange silhouettes from another sky, flying low, flying deliberate, flying for them. The sound stitched a thread across the sky, and Paris held their breath and listened. No parachutes, no bombs, just presence. Presence was enough. Someone, somewhere whispered, ILS Revenant, they're coming back. And a ripple moved through the city. Not an uprising, not yet, but a flutter, a sign, a tremble different from fear. That night, a resistance fighter walked alone to a wall in Butte AUX Kalis. In his coat pocket, a paintbrush the size of a toothbrush, a jar of 3 colors, red, white, and blue, with trembling hands. He made 3 vertical strokes. Not wide, not large, just enough. Then he walked away. Behind him, Paris had its flag again. Elsewhere, an elderly cellist tuned his instrument for the first time in months. His window open, chin lifted. He didn't play yet, but the silence felt. Ready? Children began writing on chalkboards again. Not equations from lessons, but names. Names they were warned not to say. Names of uncles. Names of sisters. Names of cities taken. And names they wanted to call their children someday. Hope does not always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it comes like weather, a subtle shift in the wind. A bird that flies farther than yesterday. A dog whose ears perk before breakfast. Paris began to notice. Paintings that had been hidden beneath wallpaper were peeled back. Letters buried in floorboards were reread, stiff with dust. Still whole. And the tower? She hadn't lit yet, but her silhouette seemed to stand straighter. Beneath those new morning clouds. One cafe reopened. Then a second. Someone discovered the gramophone still worked. They played an old jazz record, scratching and wild. 2 old friends danced in the street. Just 2. Just one song. But it was enough. In Montmartre, a child passed out small scraps of colorful ribbon, tied around spoons. When asked what it meant, they shrugged. But a woman who once worked as a sculptor recognized the sculpted silhouette of the arrangement. It was the Eiffel Tower, not drawn, not painted, shaped by hope. A hush still lay over the rooftops, but it was no longer fear. Now, it was expectation. A breath held, not because of warning, but because they dared, for the first time in a long time, to believe the war was aging, fading, growing tired, retreating. Hope had landed, not in parachutes, but in poems, in ribbons, in chalk on stone, and smiles between strangers. Everyone was waiting for the moment it would happen, the moment the tower would glow again. No one said the words aloud. They didn't have to. They'd already started dreaming of it. And tonight, for once, they might sleep without keeping one eye open. because sometimes the smallest light overhead can start to pull the whole world back toward morning. And then, as simply as someone flipping a page, it was morning, not just another morning, but the one they'd waited for, the one they'd woven into story, stitched into scarf linings, and folded into whispered prayers. Paris was free. No official trumpet announced it. No parade swept down the boulevards. No grand fireworks over the Seine. Just birdsong. An oddly quiet sound from church bells that hadn't rung in years. Soft, shy, like they were remembering how. It began at the edge of the city, where the meadows yield to cobblestone. A boy stepped outside with a wooden whistle. He looked left, then right. No soldiers, just dew. He blew the whistle, not a signal, not a warning, just for joy. In another quartier, a baker reached into his flour bin, and for the first time in years, it was full. He wept into the dough, kneaded it with hands that remembered love. That morning's bread tasted less like wheat and more like relief. Laughter rang in alleyways. Babies cried through open windows. Couples dared to walk holding hands again. It wasn't loud, but it was everywhere, the sound of life coming back. And at the center of it all, the Eiffel Tower watch. For years she had stood silent, unlit, unchanging, brooding over a city too afraid to dream in gold. Now, she seemed to lean a little into the dawn, as if squinting for someone, waiting for a cue. And then, some say it happened just after 7 a.m., others say it was later. The exact time doesn't really matter. What matters is a blink, a shimmer, a tiny flicker. On her highest light, one by one, bulbs glowed back to life, like stars slowly remembering their names. It wasn't dazzling, not yet. It wasn't a blast. It was soft, still unsure, but no longer afraid. Parisians gathered. They didn't cheer, not wildly, not at first. They stood, some holding hands, many wiping tears, all looking upward. For the first time, without fear, the tower didn't need applause. Her only language was light, and she spoke it again, with warmth, with memory, with dignity. Every shadow beneath her length seemed to lift. Even now, decades later, if you ask a certain generation of Parisians what they remember, they won't tell you about flags, or uniforms, or even speeches. They'll say, the light came back. And it did, not just in steel, but in knees that bent to garden again, in pencils sharp enough for sketching, in kisses not stolen, but given. On that day, when the tower glowed, Paris didn't erupt. She exhaled, a long, slow sigh, held for too many years, released back into the sky. And that's how the tower returned, not with a victory march, but with a breath, a blink, a flicker, like she had never really left at all.